This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief over at numberfire.com, and this is episode 143 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the Numberfire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Things are always easier to predict in hindsight. We see it in fantasy football each year. Why weren't you higher on Jared Goff last year, someone will ask me. Well, I'm sorry I didn't foresee him having the biggest jump in adjusted net yards per attempt from one year to the next in NFL history. Hindsight can certainly be helpful. We need historical evidence to make a case for the future. We need to look at results to help us with future predictions. Otherwise, we'd still assume that Rams offense is bad. But hindsight can also get us into trouble. Hindsight can force us to create narratives that really aren't true. Take handcuffing in fantasy football as a perfect example. Remember when D'Angelo Williams went off in 2015 after Le'Veon Bell suffered a season-ending injury? That year, Williams was drafted higher than usual for a backup because Le'Veon Bell was suspended for the first 2 games of the season. Williams was the workhorse back for the Steelers in weeks 1 and 2. Once Bell returned, we didn't hear from Williams for weeks. He wasn't relevant again until the Steelers' 9th game of the season, a week after Le'Veon Bell was injured. But from then on, he dominated. We look back at that season as a reason to handcuff running backs. Despite running back handcuffing being wildly unsuccessful through the years, people still point to Williams in 2015 as the reason to handcuff. And what's crazy about how we view this in hindsight is that Williams was on the majority of waiver wires when Le'Veon Bell was injured. He wasn't even rostered. People dropped D'Angelo Williams once Le'Veon Bell came back from his suspension. Hindsight tells us one thing, and it's not always the same as what actually happened. Brandon Gdula has been studying this type of bias over on Numberfire over the last few years. He's not looking at handcuffs, though. He's looking at the waiver wire. And he's looking at real data that shows us how well we've actually collectively been at predicting success off the waiver wire. I sat down with Brandon to talk about his waiver wire studies that he's done, and then I asked him how his results should change the way that we draft our fantasy football squads. You'll definitely think about things differently after hearing Brandon's thoughts. Brandon, what was the motivation for the waiver wire articles that you've been producing on Numberfire over the last couple of seasons? Was it sort of a direct response to a particular strategy like zero RB? Essentially, why did you start looking into this really unique data?
I think it was a combination of a few different things, really. After the 2015 season, which is when I first conducted the study, early round running backs were kind of falling out of favor. Just 12 were being taken inside the top 2 rounds. 9 are inside the top 2 rounds this year as of late June. So, yes, firstly, the motivation to study this came from kind of the more widespread adoption of zero RB. Secondly, I was motivated to see how good we were as a fantasy community at finding waiver wire gems. I didn't have my mind made up one way or the other about our ability to do this. I just kind of wanted to see what the numbers said. My thesis question actually was just, what is a waiver wire running back or receiver worth? It was as simple as that. And thirdly, not saying I was the first to do this type of analysis, but I just hadn't really come across any study that actually looked into how waiver wire pickups fared after being added to fantasy teams. Most analysis that I saw or did myself included performances before these players were added to teams, which doesn't help our fantasy squads. Yeah. And it actually hurts our analysis when we look back. And ultimately, I won't lie, I was a little bitter at this point. 2015 was the David Johnson rookie season. Johnson was someone who I drafted in 2015. I wasn't alone in that. He was a 10th round pick. He produced on a handful of snaps early on, had a return touchdown, looked explosive. And where I didn't draft him, I actually added him because he kept looking good. A lot of people actually added him that year after week 2, according to my data. But Bruce Arians didn't want to play him. Johnson didn't get more than 10 offensive touches or 50% of the snaps until week 13. So on some teams, I dropped him by that point. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it in some spots. You can call that bad managing if you want, but there's an opportunity cost for clinging to potential players during a single fantasy season. Then, of course, Johnson was announced the Week 13 starter because of injuries. He was a top 30 PPR back, and each week from 13 through 16 prime fantasy playoff time. He was a top 12 back in 3 of those 4. So my experience with David Johnson as a waiver wire or zero RB candidate in 2015 was pretty different than those who got him entering week 13, kind of rode him to a fantasy championship. And that mattered to me. I think some added context like that should matter when we examine prior seasons, examine our ability to prognosticate. The same thing happened with Bilal Powell the next year as well. So, this stuff just isn't as simple as clicking add and riding these players to a fantasy title. So I wanted to study it closer.
So you're talking about this study and you're talking about the analysis. Can you explain the process that you went through in doing these waiver wire studies?
The process itself is pretty simple. Using weekly waiver addition numbers from fleaflicker.com, I found the players who were added at the highest rate in a single week during each season since 2010. From there, I examined how they performed after being added to our fantasy teams in a big number. I also looked at their 2 weeks leading into the addition to compare to see if big performances were triggering the influx in additions. I do focus primarily on the top 30 additions at each position, so running back and receiver for each season. So that's about 2 per week during the year, but I do narrow it down at times to see the top 10 or 12 ads at certain points in the research. But the reason for the top 30 cutoff just is that I wanted to look at the more obvious additions each season to see how those quote unquote like can't miss or must add additions sort of fared. We shouldn't care or rely on like anecdotes where, I had someone tell me that like someone dropped Todd Gurley one season and he picked him up and rode him to a fantasy title, and like we shouldn't bank on that. So I try to weed that stuff out. And the cutoff also helped to weed out some of the more speculative ads, guys who weren't expected to make an immediate impact, not stepping into a bigger role all of a sudden because of injury. Kind of like a David Johnson back in 2015. And, frankly, if finding waiver replacements was easy or hard or entirely random, the top 30 should show that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So let's start with the high-level results of the study and then sort of dig into specific examples. What is the data that you've compiled showed you? Are we actually good at playing the waiver wire? Are there actually viable options at running back and wide receiver to grab off the waiver wire each week?
So that's a few questions. The first, just kind of at the high level, we're almost always late to react to waiver wire pickups, especially at wide receiver. That was kind of an unintended finding of this study, really. But frankly, it might be the most important. That should shape our sort of retroactive analysis of these players, that their best performances may have come when they were barely owned, let alone started on fantasy teams. It's just good to keep in mind that we're slow to react because when we can't spot most breakouts or backfield changes until they actually happen. Shocker, we can't predict when a starter is going to get hurt, anything like that. But by the time we add and start these players, their best weeks are generally behind them because they aren't early round talents who have, high volume roles as well. So they just can't really sustain the production that generally leads to the influx in additions. And that means that we're kind of just reacting to peak performances and adding these players just in time for them to be kind of mediocre fantasy assets again. The high level takeaways from a sort of positional standpoint, we can't replicate or replace the ceiling of early round picks with waiver additions. By that, I mean, the top waiver claims each year don't score top 12 or top 24 level weeks at a rate that's on par with the top 12 running backs and receivers in terms of average draft position. That should make sense. That's not groundbreaking. But when you look only at a waiver player's post-addition performance and account for missed games from players who were drafted, the top 12 backs and receivers in terms of average draft position just outshine these waiver players, which should at least impact our thinking about passing up those first, second, even third round running backs who kind of have a stranglehold on their backfields entering the season. To put that a little bit more clearly, even with the risk of missing games, getting injured, a first round running back is significantly more likely to give you ceiling and floor games than even the top waiver additions, during a season. Even when we look only at the time after these waiver players are actually added, actually have kind of an ostensible path to production, it still favors their early round picks.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have you found that there's more success at one position versus the other? And we're talking obviously about running back or wide receiver. So in other words, are we getting better value off the waiver wire at running back or at wide receiver?
Well, we can't really pluck wide receivers off the waiver wire who add a lot to our teams necessarily from a ceiling perspective. Top waiver receivers just kind of perform like low-end fantasy receivers. So they're out there if we're desperate, if we just need like low-end flexes who kind of hit or miss. But any receiver who's not really inside the top 24, one of the best, most consistent producers, they're all kind of the same from a big picture perspective with hit or miss production. As for running backs, there are more options because running back situations are generally just clearer. A waiver wire running back can be projected for 20 touches, play 50 to 60% of the snaps the week after being added. That's not how targets go when pass catchers get hurt. We saw that in 2017 when basically every Giants pass catcher was injured. We picked up Roger Lewis, and he didn't do much from a fantasy perspective. In fact, he actually killed teams who kind of picked him up and played him because he had, I think, 3 straight weeks with fewer than 3 PPR points, something crazy like that. So it is very different, and it is kind of hard to find receivers off the waiver wire.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So 2015, like you said, that was a big year for zero RB. But, looking back and in hindsight, it also looks like somewhat of an outlier season. Did your results show the same? Did 2015 provide a lot more useful waiver wire running backs than other seasons did?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, especially in terms of like ceiling performances, like top 12 weeks. I like to hone in on the 4 weeks after we add these players just to see like a short-term window of kind of replaceability for them. Not every addition is, as well as expected to take over a huge role for the rest of the season. After all, it could be just a short-term injury for a starter. But 2015's running back class posted a top 12 week 32% of the time in that 4-week post-addition window. No other class since 2010 top 23%. And that came after 3 straight seasons with a top 12 hit rate below 16% for these additions. So, looking back, it probably just felt extra refreshing to find some waiver wire gems after 3 straight down years from waiver wire running backs. But if we open that up and look at top 24 performances in that span, the 2015 class, still good, just doesn't stand out quite as much from that perspective. They had a 48% hit rate in that 4-week window. Again, 48% of their weeks were top 24 performances in terms of PPR scoring. In those 4 weeks after we added them, it was actually 47% in 2016. It was 48% back in 2010. So it wasn't entirely off the charts or, it wasn't an anomaly by any means, but it was probably the best overall waiver class over the past 8 seasons. But I think maybe, perhaps that class came just at the right time with zero RB sort of gaining traction with injuries in that 2015 season to the early round running backs. And I think it caused us maybe to get a little overconfident with our ability to find these replacement running backs from the waiver wire.
So I've got to ask you, because I very, very strongly oppose handcuffing in fantasy football, as people who listen to the show know. Have some of the unsuccessful waiver wire running back claims been the result of just not knowing who a running back handcuff is? Or I guess I could say, how often do we see people picking up running backs at a high rate after that running back didn't have a big performance? So essentially someone who's stepping into a situation where his starter got hurt.
Well, Fozzie Whitaker was the most added. he was the most added running back in a single week in 2016 after Jonathan Stewart got hurt. The next week that year, Jordan Howard kind of became a must-add. So, you can take stabs at these guys, but you also put yourself at a risk of sort of missing out. So it's one reason to sort of petition your commissioner to give you a free agency budget rather than just waiver order. But also Kerwin Williams was the second most added player in a week in 2017 after David Johnson's injury. So that those 2 examples right there kind of might answer your question. But as for Williams, he had no weeks inside the top 50 in terms of PPR ranks from week 2. So after his pickup to week 12. So that's 10 straight weeks without a top 50 PPR performance. But then in weeks 13 through 16, he was a top 36 back 3 times, sort of giving you some low-end potential in the playoffs. So it depended on when you picked them up, what your expectations were. But, for the sample over the past 8 seasons, we have 240 backs who were top 30 additions by my method. 227 of those players played the week prior to the addition. Only 50 of those, so just 22%, were worse than the RB 36 that week prior to being added. So it's not often that we're adding these guys after a dud week for one reason or another. Another 13 were added at a high rate after not playing the week prior. So if we add those in, we have 64 players in our sample. But these more speculative additions, these kind of unfinished players, finished outside the top 36 56% of the time. That next week, it's 64% actually if you factor in missed games. And the numbers worsen or just stay bad from there. RBs who had a top 36 week before being added fall outside the top 36 just 38% of the time that first week after we add them to our team. So in situations where perhaps we didn't see a back take over the week prior, do seem like worse bets when there's that ambiguity than the players who at least gave us 1 week of good production before we added them.
Yeah, so basically we have some sort of sample size in a way of these players producing in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to these guys just coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. If we haven't seen it, there might be a reason why we haven't seen it, and the numbers just say that it's not quite as likely that these guys are worth the pickup.
So the big question to ask, and the final one that I'm going to ask you, how do you think that this all should affect fantasy football draft strategy?
I feel like there's a lot of pressure in the fantasy community to sort of take stands and be bold about our predictions, but I'm of the mindset that we kind of just need to embrace being wrong because we're wrong often, and that we should just account for that. Hit rates don't matter if you're just perfect with your analysis, can nail every situation. I'm not, and I know that I'm not, so I want to play the percentages. So to me, what these numbers say is that we need to be okay with taking a first-round running back, especially like the top 4 this season. The potential weekly floor and ceiling for these guys, even when you account for those missed games, the potential to miss these games, they just dominate the other running backs. Something I didn't even get into is that running backs drafted 13th through 30th, so not even, not late-round picks, but just not the clear-cut guys with great situations. They're generally worse than the top 12 waiver ads for the year. The reason for that, we can kind of extrapolate, is that we're adding waiver guys when the situation becomes clearer. 5th and 6th round picks, running backs, they don't necessarily have a clear path to production, and they may never get that path cleared during the season. Waiver additions at least have that much going for them. So, at running back, draft them early, or just maybe wait and take flyers off the waiver wire when volume pops up. At receiver, we kind of also need to draft them early for more realistic ceilings and floors. If you can't get like Le'Veon Bell or David Johnson or Todd Gurley, like you should still be trying to go with elite wide receivers. But you'll probably want to snare like a low end, running back 1. So maybe like a guy with an ADP of like 8 to 14. That, or just wait as long as possible and try to employ 0 RB full on, and then you can avoid wasting waiver capital on receivers. But the 3rd through 6th rounds still offer some good usable receivers. So I think we should load up on them after we get our elite running backs if possible. Just again, relying on waiver receivers, not a good bet. Potentially the real takeaway is, trying to trade those guys if we can during the season. But implicit in all this is just, don't spend early picks on quarterbacks and tight ends because we're missing out on a chance at the most likely, most realistic elite performers at the positions that matter. And pretty sure you can get on board with that, JJ.
I sure can. It always comes back to opportunity cost. Brandon, thank you so much for hopping on and talking about these studies. If you guys want links to those studies, feel free to hit up Brandon on Twitter at Gdula13. I'm also on Twitter at LateRoundQB, and don't forget to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast by searching for it pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.